The morning sun cast long shadows across Westminster Abbey as thousands of people gathered along the streets of London. Today was different from any other day in recent history. The air buzzed with excitement and anticipation as the nation prepared for what would become one of the most emotional moments in British royal history. Sarah Mitchell stood among the crowd, clutching a small British flag in her weathered hands. At 67 years old, she had witnessed many royal events throughout her lifetime, but nothing compared to the electricity she felt in the air this morning. She had traveled from her small cottage in Yorkshire, taking an overnight bus to reach London in time for the ceremony. Behind the scenes at Buckingham Palace, Prince William paced nervously in his private chambers. His staff had noticed something different about him over the past few weeks. There was a weight on his shoulders that seemed heavier than the usual, pressures of royal duty. His private secretary, James Henderson, knocked gently on the door before entering. "Your Royal Highness, the final preparations are nearly complete," James announced, his voice carrying the formal tone required in such situations. William nodded, but his mind seemed elsewhere, focused on something that only he knew about. The prince had been working on something secret for months, something that would surprise not just the thousands gathered outside, but millions watching around the world. It was a plan that had required careful coordination with various government officials, charity organizations, and even international diplomats. The weight of what he was about to do pressed heavily on his chest. Meanwhile, in a small apartment in East London, Maria Santos was getting her two young children ready to watch the ceremony on television. She worked 3 jobs to make ends meet. And today was one of the rare occasions when she could sit down with her family and enjoy something together. Her 8-year-old daughter, Isabella, was particularly excited about seeing the real prince on television. Maria had no idea that her life was about to change forever, or that the struggles she faced daily as a single mother working multiple jobs to support her family had somehow reached the attention of people in very high places. The letter that would arrive at her door later that week was still being prepared in the Royal Correspondence Office. Across the country, similar scenes were playing out in homes, community centers, and public gathering places. The British people, and indeed people around the world, had tuned in to witness this historic moment, unaware that they were about to witness something unprecedented in royal history. At Westminster Abbey, the final security checks were being completed. Archbishop of Canterbury had arrived early, reviewing his notes one final time. The ancient building had hosted countless royal ceremonies over the centuries, but today it would witness something that would be remembered for generations to come. Television crews from dozens of countries were positioned at strategic locations, their cameras ready to capture every moment of the ceremony. The lead broadcaster for the BBC, David Reynolds, had covered royal events for over 2 decades, but even he sensed that something unusual was planned for today's proceedings. In the royal waiting area, Prince William's children were being prepared by their nannies. The young royals had been briefed about the special nature of today's event, though they didn't fully understand the magnitude of what their father was about to announce to the world. Their innocent excitement added a layer of warmth to an already emotionally charged atmosphere. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, stood beside her husband, offering quiet words of encouragement. She had been William's closest confidant throughout the planning of his surprise announcement, and she understood better than anyone the personal significance of what he was about to do. Her own background and experiences had shaped her understanding of the struggles faced by ordinary families across Britain. The palace kitchen staff had been working since dawn, preparing refreshments for the thousands of guests who would attend the reception following the ceremony. They moved with practiced efficiency, unaware that their usual post-ceremony celebrations would be overshadowed by the emotional impact of the prince's surprise. Outside, the crowd continued to grow. People from all walks of life had gathered to witness this moment in history. There were elderly couples who had followed the royal family for decades, young families introducing their children to royal traditions, and tourists from around the world who had planned their trips specifically to be present for this occasion. The Metropolitan Police had deployed their largest security operation in years, with officers positioned throughout London to ensure the safety of all attendees. Detective Inspector Michael Thompson, who was overseeing security at Westminster Abbey, had been briefed about the special nature of today's ceremony, though he had been sworn to secrecy about the details. In the royal stables, the horses that would pull the ceremonial carriages were being given their final grooming. The stable hands worked with quiet concentration, understanding that their work contributed to the pageantry that the world expected. From British royal ceremonies, each detail had to be perfect. The morning continued to unfold with precision timing that only comes from months of careful planning. Royal protocol officers moved through the Abbey, checking and double-checking that every element was in place. The flower arrangements positioned throughout the ancient building filled the air with a subtle fragrance that complemented the solemnity of the occasion. As the hours passed, the anticipation continued to build. Social media platforms buzzed, with speculation about what might make today's ceremony special, but none of the rumors came close to the reality of what Prince William had planned. The surprise that awaited would touch the hearts of millions and demonstrate a side of royal duty that had never been seen before. The stage was set for a moment that would redefine what it meant to serve as a member of the British royal family in the modern era. Prince William's decision to break with centuries of tradition was about to create ripples that would be felt far beyond the walls of Westminster Abbey, touching lives in ways that no one could have predicted. A coronation surprise with Prince William brings tears to millions. Part 2. The ceremony began with the traditional pomp and circumstance that the world expected from British royal events. The magnificent procession moved through London's historic streets as millions watched from their homes, offices, and public gathering places around the globe. The sound of ceremonial drums echoed off ancient buildings, while horse-drawn carriages carried members of the royal family toward Westminster Abbey. Inside the Abbey, distinguished guests from around the world had taken their seats. Prime ministers, presidents, and monarchs from dozens of countries sat alongside religious leaders, charitable organization representatives, and carefully selected members of the British public. The atmosphere was both reverent and electric, with anticipation. However, what nobody in attendance knew was that Prince William had personally requested that specific individuals be invited to this ceremony. These weren't the usual dignitaries or celebrities that typically attended royal events. Instead, scattered throughout the Abbey were ordinary people whose stories had somehow reached the prince's attention over the past year. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, an 82-year-old volunteer who had spent 40 years serving meals at a homeless shelter in Manchester, sat nervously in the third row. She had received an invitation weeks ago and still couldn't believe she was actually there. Her weathered hands, which had served thousands of meals to those in need, trembled slightly as she watched the proceedings unfold. Near the back of the Abbey sat David Chen, a young teacher from Birmingham who had used his own savings to buy winter coats for students in his underfunded school. He had no idea why he had been invited, but he felt honored to witness this historic moment alongside people he assumed were much more important than a simple primary school teacher. The traditional elements of the ceremony proceeded as planned. The Archbishop of Canterbury delivered the expected prayers and blessings, while the royal family maintained their composed dignity throughout the formal proceedings. Television cameras captured every moment, broadcasting to an estimated global audience of over 2 billion people. But as the ceremony reached its midpoint, something unexpected happened. Prince William stepped forward to a microphone that had been specifically installed for this moment. The Abbey fell silent, and television commentators around the world paused their narration, sensing that something unprecedented was about to occur. Today, Prince William began, his voice carrying clearly through the ancient building, I want to speak not just to those gathered here, but to everyone watching around the world. We gather in this sacred place not just to honor tradition, but to recognize the extraordinary, ordinary people who make our communities stronger every single day. A murmur of surprise rippled through the abbey. This wasn't part of the traditional ceremony that everyone had been expecting. Royal protocol officers exchanged glances, though they had been briefed that the prince would be making an unscheduled address. Over the past year, William continued, I have had the privilege of learning about remarkable individuals whose acts of kindness, courage, and service often go unnoticed by the wider world. Today, I want to change that. The television audience around the world leaned forward in their chairs. Social media platforms exploded with speculation about what the prince was about to announce. In living rooms across Britain and beyond, families gathered closer to their television screens. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, the prince said, and the elderly woman in the third row gasped audibly. For 40 years, you have served meals to homeless individuals in Manchester, never missing a single day, even when your own health was failing. You represent the very best of British compassion and service. The cameras focused on Mrs. Thompson, whose eyes filled with tears as she realized that her decades of quiet service had somehow been recognized at the highest level of British society. Around her, other guests began to understand that this ceremony was taking an unprecedented direction. David Chen, William continued, you spent your own savings to ensure that children in your school had warm coats during the coldest winter in decades. When the local authority couldn't provide adequate funding, you didn't complain or make excuses. You simply acted with the generosity that defines the teaching profession at its finest. David Chen's hands flew to his mouth in disbelief as cameras captured his emotional reaction. His colleagues watching from Birmingham couldn't believe that. Their quiet, dedicated friend was being recognized in front of the entire world. One by one, Prince William called out the names of individuals scattered throughout the abbey. There was Patricia Williams, a nurse who had worked double shifts throughout the pandemic without complaint. There was Mohammed Hassan, a shop owner who had provided free groceries to struggling families during the economic downturn. There was Jennifer Roberts, a teenager who had organized clothing drives for refugees in her spare time. Each recognition brought fresh tears and gasps of surprise from both the individuals being honored and the global audience watching. This wasn't the formal, distant royal ceremony that people had expected. Instead, it was becoming a deeply personal celebration of human kindness and service. The prince's voice grew stronger and more emotional as he continued. These individuals, and thousands like them across our nation and around the world, represent the true meaning of service. They don't serve because they were born to privilege or because they seek recognition. They serve because they recognize that we all have a responsibility to care for one another. In homes across Britain, people who had been watching casually found themselves reaching for tissues. The ceremony had transformed from a traditional royal event into something that spoke directly to the human experience of compassion and community. Television commentators struggled to find words to describe what they were witnessing. This departure from royal protocol was unprecedented in modern history, and its emotional impact was being felt in real time across the globe. Today, Prince William announced, I am establishing the Crown Service Foundation, which will provide recognition and support to individuals whose quiet acts of service make our communities stronger. But more importantly, I am making a personal commitment that will change how I fulfill my duties as a member of the royal family. The abbey fell completely silent as everyone waited to hear what this commitment would entail. Even the most seasoned royal observers had no idea what the prince was about to announce next. A coronation surprise with Prince William brings tears to millions. Part 3, Prince William took a deep breath, and for a moment, the formal composure that had been carefully maintained throughout his royal training seemed to falter. What the global audience was witnessing was not the carefully rehearsed speech of a future king, but the heartfelt words of a man who had been profoundly moved by the stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. I am committing, William said, his voice breaking slightly with emotion, to spend one day each month for the rest of my life working alongside individuals like those we have honored today, not as a royal patron visiting for photographs and ceremonies, but as a volunteer, learning from their dedication and contributing to their important work. The silence in Westminster Abbey was deafening. This announcement went far beyond what anyone had imagined possible. Members of the royal household, who had spent their careers managing carefully controlled public appearances, exchanged looks of amazement and concern. This was uncharted territory for the monarchy. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, smiled through tears as she watched her husband make this unprecedented commitment. She had been part of the planning process and understood the personal journey that had led William to this moment. The decision hadn't been made lightly, and it represented a fundamental shift in how they would approach their royal duties. In living rooms around the world, people were experiencing a range of emotions they had never expected to feel during a royal ceremony. Maria Santos, the single mother in East London, found herself crying as she watched with her children. Something about the prince's sincerity and commitment resonated deeply with her own struggles to balance work and family while trying to contribute positively to her community. Furthermore, William continued, his voice growing stronger, I am announcing the creation of the Community Heroes Program, which will identify and support individuals whose service might otherwise go unrecognized. But this program will not be administered from palace offices or through traditional charitable structures. The prince paused, looking directly into the camera that was broadcasting to billions of people worldwide. Instead, I will be personally visiting communities across Britain and beyond, working alongside local volunteers to understand their challenges and learn from their solutions. The monarchy must evolve to serve not just as a symbol, but as an active participant in building stronger communities. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, still struggling to process that she had been personally recognized by the prince, felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was witnessing. In all her years of quiet service, she had never imagined that her work could inspire such a dramatic change in how the royal family approached their responsibilities. The television cameras captured reactions throughout the Abbey and around the world. In Manchester, the homeless shelter where Mrs. Thompson volunteered was packed with people watching the ceremony. When they saw their beloved volunteer being honored, cheers erupted throughout the building. Many of the individuals she had served over the years were wiping away tears, understanding for the first time how much her daily presence had meant to the broader community. Similarly, at David Chen's school in Birmingham, students and teachers had gathered in the main hall to watch their colleague receive recognition. The children who had received winter coats through his generosity were jumping up and down with excitement, finally understanding why their teacher had seemed so modest when they thanked him. But the emotional impact extended far beyond those directly mentioned in the ceremony. Around the world, people were reflecting on the unsung heroes in their own communities. Social media platforms were flooded with stories of local volunteers, teachers, healthcare workers, and community leaders whose contributions had previously gone unnoticed by the broader public. Prince William wasn't finished with his announcements. I want to share with you why this commitment is so personally important to me, he said, his formal royal bearing completely abandoned in favor of genuine, heartfelt communication. Several months ago, I received a letter from a young girl named Sophie Henderson, age 9, from Cornwall. She wrote to tell me about her grandmother, who had been volunteering at a local food bank but had to stop because of her health. Sophie asked if I could help find more volunteers because the hungry people still need food, and Grandma is sad that she can't help them anymore. The prince's voice wavered as he continued. That letter changed my perspective on what service truly means. Sophie's grandmother, like thousands of others, had been quietly ensuring that members of her community didn't go hungry. When her health prevented her from continuing, it wasn't just a personal loss. It was a community crisis. The emotional weight of this story was felt throughout the Abbey and around the world. Parents watching with their children found themselves explaining the importance of helping others, while young people were inspired by the idea that a simple letter could lead to such significant change. I traveled to Cornwall to meet Sophie and her grandmother, William revealed. What I discovered was an entire network of volunteers, most of them elderly, who had been maintaining essential community services with little recognition and no sustainable support system. When one person could no longer serve, the entire community felt the impact. The prince looked directly at the camera again. This cannot continue. We cannot rely on the goodwill of individuals without providing them with the support, recognition, and sustainable systems they need to continue their vital work. The announcement was having ripple effects beyond what anyone could have predicted. In government offices across Britain, civil servants were frantically taking notes, understanding that the prince's commitments would require unprecedented coordination between royal activities and public policy initiatives. International observers were equally stunned by the boldness of William's approach. Never before had a member of the British royal family made such specific, measurable commitments to direct community service. Royal historians would later describe this moment as a watershed in the evolution of the modern monarchy. Today marks the beginning of a new chapter, Prince William concluded this portion of his address. Not just for the royal family, but for how we understand service, community, and our responsibility to one another. The Abbey remained silent, but outside, the crowds that had gathered to witness a traditional ceremony found themselves part of something entirely different, a moment that was challenging assumptions about duty, service, and the role of leadership in modern society. A coronation surprise with Prince William brings tears to millions. Part 4A's. Prince William's words continued to resonate throughout Westminster Abbey and across the world. Something unprecedented began to happen. The formal barriers that had traditionally separated the royal family from the general public seemed to dissolve completely. What had begun as a ceremonial event was transforming into a moment of genuine human connection that transcended social boundaries and cultural differences. "I want to introduce you to someone very special," William said, gesturing toward the side of the Abbey. A small figure emerged from the shadows, Sophie Henderson, the 9-year-old girl whose letter had sparked this entire transformation. She walked nervously toward the prince, clutching a handwritten card in her small hands. The sight of this child, dressed in her best dress with her hair carefully braided, walking across the ancient stones of Westminster Abbey toward the future. King of England created one of the most powerful images in modern royal history. Television cameras around the world focused on her determined steps, and millions of viewers found themselves holding their breath. "Sophie," Prince William said, kneeling down to her level in front of the entire global audience. "Your letter taught me that sometimes the most important wisdom comes from the youngest voices. Would you like to tell everyone about your grandmother?" Sophie looked up at the prince, then at the vast crowd of distinguished guests, and finally directly into the camera. Despite being just 9 years old, she spoke with a clarity and conviction that silenced the Abbey. "My grandma Martha says that when people are hungry, you don't ask questions, you just help. She's been making sandwiches for people who don't have food for as long as I can remember. But now her hands hurt too much, and she cries sometimes because she thinks people might be hungry and she can't help them anymore." The innocence of her words, delivered without any understanding of their political or social implications, created a moment of pure emotional truth that touched every person watching. In homes around the world, grandparents were thinking about their own limitations. Parents were considering how to teach their children about service, and young people were questioning what they could do to help their communities. Prince William took Sophie's hand. "Sophie, I want to make you a promise, not just as a prince, but as someone who learned something important from your letter. We're going to make sure that when volunteers like your grandmother can no longer serve, there are systems in place to support the important work they've been doing." He stood and addressed the global audience again. This is why the commitments I'm making today are so crucial. Sophie's grandmother represents thousands of dedicated volunteers who have been maintaining the fabric of our communities without adequate support or recognition. When they can no longer serve, entire communities suffer. The emotional impact of this interaction was being felt in real time across social media platforms. The hashtag #BoshSophie'sLetter began trending globally within minutes as people shared stories of elderly volunteers in their own communities who were struggling to continue their service due to health or resource constraints. But Prince William had more surprises in store. "I want to share the first concrete action that will result from today's announcements," he said. "Next week, I will begin my first volunteer assignment at the food bank where Sophie's grandmother served for over 15 years. I will work there every Tuesday for the next month, not as a royal patron, but as a volunteer learning from the experienced staff about the realities of food insecurity in modern Britain." The specificity of this commitment sent shockwaves through royal protocol offices. Never before had a member of the royal family made such detailed, measurable commitments to regular volunteer work. The security implications alone would require extensive planning, but William had clearly decided that the importance of the gesture outweighed the logistical challenges. Additionally, he continued, the Crown Service Foundation will immediately begin providing financial and organizational support to food banks across the United Kingdom, starting with the facility in Cornwall where Sophie's grandmother volunteered. But this is just the beginning. The prince then made an announcement that stunned even his closest advisors. "I am inviting everyone watching today to join me in a national month of service. During the coming weeks, I challenge every person who is able to volunteer just 4 hours of their time to help someone in their community. It doesn't matter if you help at a food bank, visit elderly neighbors, clean up local parks, or tutor children who need extra support. The goal is simple: to demonstrate that service to others is not just the responsibility of royal families or government agencies, but the responsibility of every citizen." The response to this challenge was immediate and overwhelming. Social media platforms crashed temporarily as millions of people began sharing their own volunteer commitments using hashtags like EU Service Challenge and EU Community Service. Local volunteer organizations around the world reported their phones ringing constantly as people inquired about volunteer opportunities. In Parliament, members from all political parties found themselves scrambling to respond to the prince's announcements. The commitments he had made would require coordination between royal activities and government policies in ways that had never been attempted before. Some praised his bold leadership, while others worried about the constitutional implications of such direct royal involvement in social issues. But the most powerful responses came from ordinary citizens who felt inspired by what they had witnessed. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, still sitting in Westminster Abbey, found herself surrounded by other honored guests who wanted to learn about her volunteer work. David Chen was already making plans to expand his winter coat program with the support he had been promised. Around the world, people were making immediate commitments to volunteer in their own communities. The ceremony had created a moment of collective inspiration that transcended national boundaries and cultural differences. Sophie Henderson, still standing beside Prince William, looked up at him with the serious expression that only children can maintain when discussing important matters. "Prince William," she said, loud enough for the microphones to capture, "does this mean my grandma doesn't have to be sad anymore?" William knelt down again, and this time his emotional composure finally broke completely. With tears in his eyes, visible to the billions watching worldwide, he said, "Sophie, your grandmother should be very proud. Her years of service inspired something that will help communities all over the world. She doesn't need to be sad anymore because her work is going to continue in ways she never imagined possible." The image of the future King of England, tears streaming down his face as he comforted a 9-year-old girl who was worried about her grandmother's sadness, became one of the most shared photographs in social media history. It represented a complete transformation in how people understood the relationship between leadership, service, and genuine human compassion. The days following Prince William's unprecedented announcements transformed communities across Britain and around the world in ways that no one could have predicted. The traditional post-ceremony analysis that usually focused on fashion choices and protocol adherence was completely overshadowed by discussions about volunteer work, community service, and the role of leadership in modern society. Maria Santos, the single mother from East London who had watched the ceremony with her children, found herself inspired to action. Despite her demanding work schedule, she organized a group of neighbors to provide free childcare for other working parents in her apartment building. Within a week, their informal network had grown to include 15 families helping each other manage the challenges of balancing work and parenting. The letter that arrived at Maria's door 3 days after the ceremony came as a complete surprise. The official royal letterhead seemed impossible to believe, but the message was unmistakably personal. Prince William's office had somehow learned about her community organizing efforts and wanted to include her building's childcare network in the Crown Service Foundation's first round of support grants. Maria read the letter 3 times before calling her mother, speaking rapidly in Spanish as she tried to explain that the Prince of Wales wanted to help fund their neighborhood childcare program. Her 8-year-old daughter, Isabella, who had been so excited to see the real prince on television, could hardly believe that he had somehow noticed their small community project. Similar scenes were playing out across the country. The National month of service that Prince William had challenged people to participate in was exceeding all expectations. Volunteer organizations reported unprecedented levels of interest from people who had never volunteered before. Food banks, homeless shelters, literacy programs, and environmental cleanup projects were overwhelmed by offers of help. In Cornwall, Sophie Henderson's grandmother, Martha, was experiencing something she had never expected in her 78 years of life. The food bank where she had volunteered for 15 years was receiving so much attention and support that they were able to expand their services to reach neighboring communities. More importantly for Martha, dozens of new volunteers had joined, ensuring that the work could continue even when individual volunteers faced health challenges. Prince William kept his commitment to begin volunteering at the Cornwall Food Bank. On his first Tuesday, he arrived without the usual royal fanfare, no photographers, no formal ceremonies, just a man ready to work. The volunteers who had been nervous about working alongside royalty quickly discovered that he was genuinely interested in learning from their experience and contributing meaningfully to their efforts. Martha Henderson, Sophie's grandmother, had been chosen to train the prince in food distribution procedures. The image of the elderly volunteer patiently explaining proper food handling techniques to the future King of England, while he listened attentively and took notes, captured the essence of what the ceremony had been trying to achieve. "Your Royal Highness," Martha said during their first working session, "the most important thing to remember is that everyone who comes here has a story. We don't ask what brought them to need our help, but we make sure they know they're welcome and respected." William spent 4 hours that first day sorting donations, preparing food packages, and serving meals to community members. By the end of the session, he was exhausted but energized by the experience. The volunteers who had worked alongside him reported that he had contributed as much as any regular volunteer, asking thoughtful questions and genuinely engaging with the people they served. The ripple effects extended far beyond individual volunteer efforts. Corporations around the world began implementing employee volunteer programs, inspired by the prince's example. Schools integrated community service projects into their curricula, and local governments started recognizing and supporting volunteer networks in unprecedented ways. International leaders were taking notice as well. The Prime Minister of Canada announced a similar national service initiative, while the President of Ireland invited Prince William to share his approach with Irish community organizations. The European Union began developing policies to support volunteer networks across member nations, using the Crown Service Foundation as a model. But perhaps the most significant impact was on young people. Sophie Henderson had become an inadvertent spokesperson for youth involvement in community service. Schools across Britain were reporting increased interest in volunteer programs, with students organizing their own community service projects inspired by Sophie's letter. At David Chen's school in Birmingham, his recognition during the ceremony had inspired a school-wide initiative. Students were raising money not just for winter coats, but for school supplies, healthy snacks, and even a small library of books that students could take home. The children who had received coats through his original program were now leading efforts to help other students in need. The emotional impact of the ceremony continued to resonate in unexpected ways. Mental health professionals reported that many people were finding that volunteer work was helping them cope with feelings of isolation and purposelessness that had become widespread during difficult economic times. The sense of community connection that came from working together on shared goals was providing benefits that extended far beyond the immediate service being provided. Prince William's commitment to monthly volunteer work was being documented and shared, but not in the traditional, royal fashion. Instead of formal photo opportunities, the coverage focused on the actual impact of the work being done and the lessons being learned. His experiences were being used to inform policy discussions about how government and charitable organizations could better support volunteer networks. The Crown Service Foundation had received thousands of applications for support within its first week of operation. The demand for recognition and assistance for community volunteers far exceeded what anyone had anticipated, requiring rapid expansion of the Foundation's staff and resources. However, the most powerful testimonial came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, the 82-year-old volunteer who had been honored during the ceremony, wrote a letter to Prince William that was later shared publicly with her permission. "Your Royal Highness," her letter read, "in 40 years of serving meals to people in need, I never imagined that my small contribution could inspire such widespread action. Watching communities come together to help one another has been the greatest gift I could have received. You have shown that leadership means listening to ordinary people and learning from their dedication. Thank you for reminding everyone that service to others is not a burden, but a privilege." The transformation that began with a 9-year-old's letter about her grandmother's sadness had evolved into a global movement that was redefining expectations about citizenship, leadership, and community responsibility. The ceremony that had surprised millions was continuing to inspire action weeks after the cameras had stopped rolling. A coronation surprise, with Prince William, brings tears to millions. Part 6, 6 months after the ceremony that changed everything, the impact of Prince William's unprecedented announcements had woven itself into the fabric of daily life in communities around the world. What had begun as a royal surprise had evolved into a sustainable movement that was transforming how people understood their responsibilities to one another. The first official report from the Crown Service Foundation revealed statistics that surprised even the most optimistic supporters of the initiative. Over 2 million people had participated in the National Month of Service, contributing more than 8 million hours of volunteer work. But more importantly, 60% of those volunteers had continued their service beyond the initial challenge, creating lasting partnerships with community organizations. Maria Santos had become a local leader in her East London community. The informal childcare network she had started after watching the ceremony had grown into a registered non-profit organization serving over 200 families. When Prince William visited their community center to see the program in action, Maria's daughter Isabella served as his tour guide, proudly explaining how their neighborhood had come together to help each other. "Prince William," Isabella said with the confidence that only children possess, "my mom says that your ceremony made people remember that we're supposed to take care of each other. Is that what kings and princes are supposed to do?" William knelt down to Isabella's level, just as he had done with Sophie Henderson 6 months earlier. "Isabella, I think you and your mother have taught me that everyone is supposed to take care of each other. Kings and princes just have more opportunities to help organize that care. The exchange was captured by local media and became another viral moment, but this time, the focus was on how the initial inspiration from the ceremony had grown into tangible, lasting change in real communities. In Cornwall, the food bank where Martha Henderson had volunteered for 15 years had become a model for community-supported volunteer networks around the world. The facility now served 3 times as many families as before, but with twice as many volunteers, the workload for individual contributors had actually decreased. More importantly, the program had expanded to include job training, financial, literacy classes, and mental health support services. Sophie Henderson, now 10 years old, had become an advocate for intergenerational volunteer programs. Her idea to pair elderly volunteers with younger community members had been adopted by hundreds of organizations, creating mentorship relationships that benefited both age groups. When she was invited to speak at a national conference on volunteerism, her simple message resonated with policymakers and community leaders alike. "My grandma taught me that helping people isn't complicated," Sophie told the audience of adults who hung on every word. "You just have to pay attention to what people need and then do something about it." When Grandma couldn't make sandwiches anymore, I thought the hungry people would stay hungry. But Prince William showed us that when one person can't help anymore, other people can step in. That's what communities are for. The policy implications of the movement had extended far beyond what anyone had initially imagined. The British government had created a new cabinet position focused on volunteer coordination and community resilience. Similar positions were being established in governments around the world, recognizing that volunteer networks represented critical infrastructure that required official support and coordination. Prince William's monthly volunteer commitments had taken him to communities across Britain and internationally. Each assignment had been carefully chosen to highlight different aspects of community service, from environmental restoration projects in Scotland to literacy programs in inner-city Manchester, from elderly care facilities in Wales to refugee support services in London. The documentation of these experiences had created an unprecedented record of community challenges and solutions from the perspective of someone learning alongside experienced volunteers. Rather than the traditional royal visits that focused on ribbon cutting and ceremonial acknowledgments, these working sessions were generating practical insights that were informing policy discussions at the highest levels of government. David Chen, the teacher from Birmingham whose winter coat program had been recognized during the ceremony, had been invited to join Prince William during a volunteer session at a literacy center in Liverpool. Working together to help struggling readers, they discovered that many of the challenges students faced were connected to broader family stresses that could be addressed through community support networks. "Your Royal Highness," David said during their lunch break, "when I started buying coats for my students, I thought I was just solving a problem with cold children. But working with you and seeing all these different programs has helped me understand that every small act of service is connected to bigger patterns of need and support." This insight had become central to the evolving philosophy of the Crown Service Foundation. Rather than treating individual volunteer efforts as isolated acts of charity, the foundation was working to help communities understand how different services connected to create comprehensive support networks. The international impact had been equally significant. When Prince William visited a refugee support center in Berlin as part of a diplomatic trip, he spent his time volunteering in their food preparation kitchen rather than attending formal receptions. The German chancellor, initially concerned about protocol violations, found herself joining him in serving meals and engaging with refugees about their experiences. This informal diplomacy through shared service had created new models for international cooperation. The European Union had established an exchange program that allowed volunteers from different countries to work together on community projects, fostering understanding and cooperation at the grassroots level. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, the 82-year-old volunteer who had been honored during the original ceremony, had become something of a celebrity in volunteer circles. Despite her age, she had found new energy through the recognition and support that her decades of service had finally received. The homeless shelter in Manchester, where she had volunteered, was now part of a network of facilities sharing resources and best practices. During a visit from Prince William to the Manchester shelter, Mrs. Thompson pulled him aside for a private conversation that would later be shared with her permission. "Your Royal Highness," she said, 40 years ago when I started volunteering here, people thought charity work was something you did if you had extra time and money. What you've done has helped people understand that serving others is essential to being human. That's a gift to every community volunteer who ever wondered if their work mattered." The emotional resonance of her words captured the fundamental transformation that had occurred. Volunteer service had shifted from being viewed as optional charitable activity to being understood as essential community infrastructure requiring systematic support and recognition. The ceremony's impact on young people had perhaps been the most profound and lasting change. Schools around the world had reported dramatic increases in student interest in community service, but more importantly, young people were approaching volunteer work with sophisticated understanding of social systems and community needs. Sophie Henderson had received hundreds of letters from children around the world who had been inspired by her story. Many of them were organizing their own community service projects, but they were also asking thoughtful questions about poverty, inequality, and social responsibility that demonstrated remarkable maturity and empathy. One letter from a 12-year-old boy in Australia particularly moved both Sophie and Prince William. "Dear Sophie," it read, "your letter to Prince William taught me that kids can make big changes happen. I started helping at a food bank in my city, and I learned that some kids at my school don't have enough food at home. I'm organizing a program where students can donate lunch money to help other students. Do you think Prince William would be proud of us?" The question prompted Sophie to write her own letter to Prince William, asking if she could help create a program for young people to share their community service ideas with each other. This suggestion led to the establishment of the Youth Community Leaders Network, which connected young volunteers around the world and provided them with resources and support for their projects. As the first anniversary of the ceremony approached, communities were planning commemorative events that focused not on remembering the past, but on celebrating the ongoing work that had grown from that initial inspiration. The day had been designated as International Community Service Day, with millions of people around the world committing to spend time volunteering in their local communities. Prince William announced that he would spend the anniversary day working, alongside the same volunteers who had inspired his original commitment. But this time, instead of being a solitary royal making a personal gesture, he would be one voice among millions of people who had discovered that serving others was not just a responsibility, but a source of meaning, connection, and hope. The ceremony that had brought tears to millions had evolved into something far more significant than anyone could have imagined. It had become proof that leadership, at its best, doesn't impose solutions from above, but rather listens to wisdom from below and creates systems that allow that wisdom to flourish. Martha Henderson, Sophie's grandmother, would later reflect that her granddaughter's simple letter had taught the world something important, that ordinary people doing ordinary acts of kindness are actually the foundation upon which extraordinary change becomes possible. The tears that had been shed during that remarkable ceremony had watered seeds of service that were now blooming in communities around the world.